Everyone, welcome back to Sharing the Brain. There's two firsts in this. One, we had like a 17-year gap between episode 2 and episode 3 in season 2. But also the second first is that we're going to have a 2-part episode 3. So we're back to do a second part with our guest, Ravae Shaeffer. And I'm here with my good pal and mate, Stu Guthrie. And I think we're going to talk about grades. Is that right, Stu?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a big topic. I know that failure rates literally across the nation, I'm sure across the world, are suffering. You know, we've put our students into this virtual distance learning platform, whether they wanted to or not. And I think we're seeing some of the results of that. The kids are struggling. And on top of that, the teachers are, because they want to, I think, assess in maybe a traditional way. And there's some just limitations. You know, when you really think about it, going back to March before, the school shutdown, nothing really has changed all that much. The kids are the same. The teachers are pretty much the same. What is the elephant in the room is that we're now doing a lot of our work virtually, and we're seeing a lot of failures. And I don't think you need to be any sort of genius to realize that this current system isn't really working that well. And our teachers, I think, are frustrated naturally, and they want to make sure they cover the content, which is what they've been asked to do for so many years. And now our assessing is being looked at. And I think it's a difficult topic. Something that I wrote a little blog about. Again, not speaking for my district, just a thought about the 50 versus the 0. And it's certainly not my idea. And I'll put a little link at the end of this video to the article that kind of started my thinking about it. But on a 100-point scale, the difference between a 0 and failing 69 is a big gap. On a 4-point scale, like what you see in most colleges, it's not that gap. It's 25 points. So anyway, the 0 versus the 50 versus just grading and assessing. So when that was posted on Twitter, I know Ravae followed up and shared a rubric that her school is working on. And I'll put that up also. We can probably drop it in as a graphic here so everybody can kind of see it while we talk about it. But Ravae, do you want to talk about that rubric and kind of the work y'all are doing around, reforming the thoughts about grading?
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting the topic. So the first thing that came to mind as you were talking, Stu, is that I was using my food processor yesterday to make pie dough, and the motor started to burn out and smoke because it was working so hard on the dough. The dough didn't have enough of an ingredient to make it work well in my food processor, and I hadn't used it for a while. And so as you were talking, I was thinking about the pressure and the heat and how there was too much happening in that one little bowl in the food processor that it couldn't process effectively. And I think that's where we are right now. I think we're asking teachers to teach face-to-face. In my school and in our district, we're asking teachers to teach students face-to-face with all the COVID-19 fears that come with that. They're teaching kids from their plexiglass trifold behind the kids' plexiglass trifold with masks on. It's scary. It's just a scary environment for our teachers, and they've named that over and over again. So with that, we also have the asynchronous, and we have remote synchronous also. So students at home learning in the moment, and students who are learning later. And what we're finding in our district is a lot of our kids went to work over the summer and even prior to that because they were asynchronous and we were all remote. And so because they did that, they haven't figured out how to rebalance back to that normal workload with a normal school load. And so in our high school, it's quite a bit. And so we saw a really incredible failure rate early on Our campus is predominantly dual credit or AP once you get to the sophomore year. And so our kids are working in rigorous learning immediately when they come onto the high school campus. And so we saw tremendous failure rates, the very high drop rates for our dual credit. It was painful. And so as we're watching, we're trying to figure out what's going on. And our folks are asking us at central office, what do you see? What are the root causes? And what I kept saying is for every student we talked to, there was a different root cause. There was no consistency across the root causes for our kids. And so it just was a real painful experience. So as staff, our team came together and said, what can we do? This is not working. We're scared. We're frustrated. We can't reach our kids. We have kids that are disconnected. We've given a hotspot and a Chromebook to every single kid, but they still are disconnected. They live in rural areas. So the internet doesn't really reach some of the areas of our district. And so literally, like there's no infrastructure that reaches there. And so we have really disconnected families. And so with all of the pain of that, we had to kind of rethink, how are we going to serve our kids better? And so one of the things that we did is we started pushing out into the community and visiting the kids. And so we had to go and physically work one-on-one. And we could see very quickly when kids got it, when they didn't get it. If we reached them by phone, we counted that as attendance and engagement. And so as you think through all of those pieces, really the only thing we could come to, and I think, Stu, I heard you say this in your communications very early on, is we're going to focus on connecting and engaging with students, building relationships, and making sure the relationship is intact before we even think about the content. And truly, I adopted that as well. We said, let's love on our kids. Let's get them in the building when it's safe. Let's get connected with them. Let's just love on them for a little while. And then we'll figure out how to get the instruction to really connect. But let's just let them know we're here. And it was really, really hard. We're an all new administrative team. Our teachers, half the staff were new to our campus. And so we were building relationships for the first time. So, so it's hard. And I think that's a key factor. So when we talk about grading isn't about the relationship you have. The relationship you have is what helps you to get transparency so you know what's actually being mastered. And so it's that transparency in the conversation that kids can explain or show what they know a little easier because they know you as a trusted adult. So when it comes to grades, I love that post that you wrote. The difference between an F that is a 0 and an F that is a 69 points, that is a ridiculous amount when we know it's only a 10-point differential between an A and a B. So as I thought about that, I kept thinking about the 50, because in the past, there have been some campuses and some of our folks on our campus who 50 was the automatic. We're just going to give a 50 because we're not giving zeros. We come from a no zero perspective. While that is true, we do believe that. What I really believe, and this is what our staff arrived at, is that a 50 had to be earned. So you had to be in conversation. You had to show your work, even if it was a submission in Google Classroom or a video that you posted, or you texted your teacher with your assignment. Whatever the teacher decided that they wanted to do to assess, that 50 had to be earned. You couldn't just have a 50, you had to earn it. So some way, whatever we could do to engage, we helped our students to earn that 50. And then from then on, we measured mastery at the 60, 70, 80, 90 level and beyond. And so our teachers had to rethink how they were engaging kids. So again, it's that food processor smoking. Again, our teachers are constantly calling and trying to make contact. And when there's good contact, we're able to effectively assess. And so that's what we really have to rethink. And for me, I'm in the middle of processing that right now, that difference between a 0 and a 59. So we're still processing that, but I'd love to hear where you guys are on that now too, because I know you've been processing it as well.
Go ahead, Stu. I think you're somewhere processing it.
Yeah, well, my food processors, I would go buy the pie and let somebody else do the processing of it. The thing is, in this example, we're not given that luxury, and that we all have our own different processors. And if you think about it in that same analogy, and I do love that. That's really fantastic, because sometimes you do a lot of work and you produce heat, but nothing really comes out of it. But sometimes you really come to things, and even like in this conversation, just having somebody else share their perspective. And that's really kind of what Steve and I wanted to do with this podcast to begin with, is just share the brain. What are you thinking? What are you talking about? What does it come from? And keeping with your analogy, Ravae, and every single teacher has that processor. Every single kid has that processor. And until we know how big or, whatever the kid's capacity is, we could be asking something that's just not going to happen. There's an example I tell our staff all the time, and this is not at just our community whatsoever. It's all across the board. It's, like the kids in the rural area not even having reliable internet service. But we also have kids who are working in a wood paneled study, with double monitors and surround sound, and they have a parent bringing peanut butter and jelly sandwiches at the break times, and God bless them. That's awesome. That's fantastic. But then the same student that's in a virtual environment just down the road perhaps has a phone, and they're watching two little brothers or sisters. And so it's a big ask for our kids. We talk about it in the school, and failure numbers get people excited and it makes the news, and rightfully so. But you get down to the level of the student, they're being asked to do a lot too. And that's where the concept of grace comes in. And it's hard. And I try to tell our teachers, and Ravae, you illustrated it perfectly. We're asking them to do 3 full-time jobs. They're teaching virtually with kids, on the computer. And I have a whole series of pictures, just as an aside, I'm going to put together before the winter break. I'm going to share it with our community to kind of, a glimpse behind the scene. Teachers can now, parents can now peek into the classrooms and watch over their kids' shoulders at what's going on. But that's just part of it. They're just seeing kind of like what we're seeing right here. The bigger picture is I have teachers that have monitors and iPads and work and all these different devices that they've kind of cobbled together. And that's a full-time job. And then on top of it, providing asynchronous assignments and having to go back in time, so to speak, and grade them and then put them all in. We're asking our teachers a lot too. And so there's no wonder we have a lot of smoking processors out there at this time. But getting back to that rubric, and again, I think I'm pretty sure I'll be able to put it up and share with you. What was I know it started with the 0 at the top, and is that just a non-negotiable? Y'all just don't issue that, or do you feel like there's still a need when a student is kind of defiantly not turning work in? Where are y'all at with just that concept by itself? What does the 0 mean? Is it even a thing where you're at?
Yeah, I think it's a signal. So that's the way I look at a 0, is it's a signal. And for me, as the administrator looking at the whole campus and just really looking for all the signals lead me to patterns. So it allows me to ask the question, what has engagement looked like with the student? What are you doing to support the student in mastering this learning that I can clearly see they haven't attempted yet? What are we doing to make that? What can I do to help you? A lot of times it might be something like I tried to call and didn't reach. I emailed and didn't get a response. And for me, that's just not good enough. And I know that it's asking a lot, and we're all in it. And I'm as willing to make phone calls about grades, one grade in one class, as anybody else on campus. And so, we're pretty small. We have about 29 people on campus. 4 of those are custodians, but we are all willing to make those calls and make those home visits. So that's the first thing, is it invites the questions. Have I done everything I can in my power to reach this family, to reach this student? And if I haven't, who on my bench can help us do that? So for us, we have a nice healthy bench. We have a counselor, a social worker, an AP, and myself. And then we also have a mentorship coordinator, all of which are considered part of the leadership team. So as a team, we say who's going out, who has talked, who hasn't talked. So it's forced us to put all of our data into one place so that we all know who's communicating and how often, because that's part of the story I have to tell as an administrator, that, if I'm calling a mom and we've had 17 outreaches and 0 connections, that's a real conversation I have to have with the parent. Do you really want to be at this career-focused, dual credit AP campus? Is this the right place for you? And if it is, what can we do to improve how we are connecting? It's a place for questions. That's what 0s are for me right now. The other place for me is that it's a place of reflection. So if I look across the campus and I see, which I did, 2 weeks into school, I saw lots of 0s and lots of absences, and we had to do something pretty quick about that. And so we had a conversation about, what does this mean? So it invited all those same questions, opportunities for reflection, and then a jump into problem solving. And I felt quite a sense of urgency. So, I mentioned I'm a new principal, and so I don't know what a non-COVID context looks like as a principal, because this is my only life as a principal so far. This is what it's like, as far as I know, right? And so it's always urgent. Everything is urgent. Everything's high priority. And so that's how we address things in the very beginning. Absences were high priority. Zeros were high priority. And so we jumped into solutions very quickly because we needed a response within a day or within 2 days. And by doing that, we burned ourselves out pretty well across the entire campus. But it then allowed us to go back and revisit, how are we assessing our students? Is a 0 really what it's intended to mean? And that's when the staff, the teachers alone, without our conversation, they went out and they created this rubric and then brought it back and introduced it to us. It was amazing. So we're happy that they're working through it and they're still refining it. But essentially you start at a 50. If you've attempted, you start at a 50, and then you continue to assess mastery to 100. So, but we're still in evolution. First attempt.
Yeah, no doubt.
I want to dig. I should say first, this is a bad dad joke, but I had hair when COVID started. So like, I understand like the COVID, non-COVID context that you're talking about, Ravae, from having, this is year 5 for me in my current principalship, my first principalship. But you said something that I think is interesting about like the 0 and about like the effort that your community is putting forth to connect with students and families. And I think that it's the idea of evidence, right? And it's also that contrast, that dissonance of like the paradigm, right? Like when I provide an assessment, I look at the number of items a student either gets correct or incorrect, and then that's the percentage, that's the grade, right? But that necessarily doesn't connect to a standard. It doesn't connect to a set of skills. It is sheerly a percentage of right versus a whole, right? A percentage is exactly what a percentage is. And when I think about like the idea of a 0 or something that's between that and the 100, I think about evidence, right? And one thing that we do in my community is we work on a mastery kind of system where students present some learning and they get some feedback on their learning, and then they revise and they represent. And this happens across all the 4 core areas for the most part at the community I work in. And I think that is the key. And so if a student receives a 0, there's no evidence. Right now, the trouble of it is that our systems are built where like a 0 goes in, and if it's average, then it just totally decimates a category or a 9 weeks or a semester, and that's where I think that again that paradigm shift that we talked about in the first part of this episode is so important to change. Right, if a community is willing to go look for evidence, like you talked about, Ravae, like go visit, call, email, whatever ways you can to get in contact with the learner and understand where they're at. That is evidence of learning. And I think that can be the most basic thing that a community can do to try and get an understanding of where a student is. And then it may not show up as a percentage. One thing I did years ago as a teacher was I had a 5-point scale, and this came from the work of Rick Wormley. If you've ever read his book Fair Isn't Always Equal, there's a second edition of it now, and it may or may not have informed the article that you read, Stu, but it talked about this idea of 0 to 4, right? This is the scale, right? And if you had a 0, I mean, it translated for us at the time to a 60, and that was just, hey, there's no evidence. And that's how I communicated it to students and to families. There's just no evidence. You haven't turned something in. You put something in there, or you give me something, and I'll assess it, and it'll be recoverable. Yes. It's not late, because this other idea, I think you said something, Ravae, is that the 50 has to be earned. And I think that kind of muddies the water between behavior and between learning, which is a tough thing, right? I mean, because if a student doesn't submit something, that's a behavior, right? That's an act, but it doesn't necessarily show what a student knows. And I think those are hard lines to try and navigate, right? It's a very fuzzy place. But if we can look for evidence of learning, that's what we're really hoping for. And that's what we really want to assess is how students have demonstrated some mastery of the content. Sorry, that was long. I've been thinking about this a little bit.
No, I think that's great. And I think, one of the issues, and when I say this, I know you are both going to nod your head because you've heard this, but we have to teach them a lesson. We have to teach them a lesson that doing, by not demonstrating that you're going to participate in my class, you're going to be taught a lesson that's a 0. Yeah. The problem, I see Steve cringing because it's cringeworthy. It really is. Yeah, and I mentioned, I think in the little thing I wrote about is, we're teaching them a lesson that they're a failure, an abject failure, and that a 0 is almost unrecoverable in certain circumstances.
Yeah.
So you want to add to that?
Well, I would, because the other thing is if it's not recoverable, right? If they get that grade and they can't do anything about it, then we're also telling them that your learning doesn't matter,
That's right.
right?
Yes.
You get the 0,
100%.
tough, we're moving along. Sorry, it is what it is. And it doesn't matter enough for the student to, well, why should I? Why should I try? Why should I continue to try and put forth the effort and engage in the learning? I think that is the thing that is maybe the toughest part to deal with, right? Is this undermining of a student's innate curiosity and their willingness to tackle problems, their willingness to collaborate. And what Ravae, you said, is like their willingness to be authentic about where they're at, right?
Yes.
To trust the adult in the room, to be there for them, to help them be better, to help them reach beyond their potential. I think that when you put in that grade that is destructive and you say there's nothing you can do about it, then you're undermining that trust. And I think that's
Yeah,
huge.
I love what you said there. And I love that you talk about evidence of learning. We talk about that as artifacts all the time. What are the artifacts that help you know that you're learning as a student and that your instruction is working for your students as a teacher? And I mean, that's critical. The artifacts are critical. I think the other side of that is that grades are not about emotions, and they're not about your relationship with that student. You get to the number that you design based on what you create by what you intend to have mastery look like in an assignment, right? So oftentimes in our reflections, the reflections on the 0 were about emotion or what I could hear as a punitive consequence for a lack of action. And I can tell you, I've had enough moments in the 150 days that I've been a principal that I needed grace every day. And I still will need grace for the rest of my life, right? If I can be a good servant leader, I'm going to need a lot of grace. We have to also extend that grace to our students in this new
100%.
context to support them. And, I need as much grace as the next person, but I'm really being realistic about what we're asking of our students, and not letting the grade reflect an emotion, but let the grade reflect performance. And an assessment of where they are in their learning. And that's what we really want kids to see and celebrate, that they are learning. Even if it's not a 100, I don't care.
Absolutely.
Are you learning? Can you talk about this with some authority,
Well, and even if it's not exactly what we think they should be learning, right? I mean, we talked before about like teacher experts, right? Like you have a degree in a particular field or a particular content area, and there is this idea that some amount of content needs to be covered. Like I need to be here in October, I need to be here in December, here in March, so I'm ready for our systemic, accountability assessment, right? We all know what that is in the state of Texas, and that I think is another troubling piece, right, in this COVID environment. Like learning, not only covering content, but learning and the demonstration of it looks so different than what we think of. And I think sometimes, like as a former social studies teacher, like I remember wanting to make sure that students learned certain things and got to a certain piece of content, and that may not be possible. And when it comes to like extending grace to our students, I think that as an instructional leader, and goodness knows that there are times that I've fallen flat on my face with this, is extending the same kind of grace for our professional teachers, right? And where they have dissonance between, I want my students to know these things or they have to know this. It's like, let's really think about those big rocks, and let's extend grace to ourselves, because that may not be possible given the context and the materials and the stratification of learners, and the context that they're learning in this year. So we have to be able to be patient with ourselves and provide that patience for them, and that understanding, hey, it's okay if you don't get to that this year, or maybe it's okay if you don't get to that this year, or what's the big learning that students can demonstrate. And man, that's been probably the hardest thing for me this year, is helping with that.
Yeah, I think it
Absolutely.
goes back to when you have so many, true professional teachers in your building, and we have tons of those folks. They don't want to, and I had a teacher tell me this, I don't want to disappoint you. And she said that to me personally. And I just, it was really kind of a little unsettling, because I appreciate that, don't get me wrong, but it's not always about me. It's about the big picture. And that level of emotion into her job was, I think, telling, where our teachers are at. And the same thing. And I know I hear your chickens in the background, Steve. I think they're telling us
it's
that
land time.
we've been clucking on too long, perhaps. So, but I will tell you both, I really enjoyed this conversation. You know, Ravae, if you've ever watched the podcast, congratulations, you're one of 50 that have actually taken the time to listen. But Steve and I started this idea years and years ago because we want to share the brain. We were, colleagues, and I think we collaborated, and we come from different ends of the spectrum a little bit in terms of our educational background, and inviting folks in with, some similar interests and backgrounds and differences has been really valuable. And this whole conversation, I know we could go on for another 30 minutes, but for the sake of those folks that are sticking it out, let's wrap it up, and let's just promise that if we get an opportunity in 17 more years when we do our next podcast, we'll get you back on, because I really enjoyed the conversation, and I want to thank you for sharing the brain. So tell us your Twitter handle, and we'll put all that in there. And anything else you want to wrap it up with us, Ravae?
Thank you. Well, I'm at Ravae96. So tweet me. I love to have these conversations, but I have to tell you, I'm celebrating the both of you for having taken the time to commit to putting your brains together and sharing it with others. This has been a really comforting space for me as a new administrator. So I want to thank you and commend you both for committing so fully to it. I have a 40-minute drive on the way to work in the morning and at night. And so sharing the brain happens in the morning a lot. So as I get through the whole series, but I just commend you both for doing this. We need this space as much as we need to create this space for our teachers. And just being able to talk something out for 30 minutes is so valuable to me. So thank you both for your service, and thank you both for creating this space. I'm looking forward to the next time that we get to have a chat, because I feel like our brains were meant to be friends. And so I'd love to share my brain with y'all and learn from yours as well in the future. Thank y'all.
Excellent. Steve,
wrap us up. Well, I would just add a small edit. Remember, Ravae, that Stu and I actually only share one brain. There's not two between the two of us. So this is actually sharing two brains today. But we want to thank you for joining us today. It was great having a two-part episode. And we also want to invite our community of like 36 strong on YouTube and maybe 50 or 60 on Twitter. If you want to share the brain with us, go ahead and tweet us at Sharing the Brain, or Mr. Guthrie tweets, or myself at Magadance. We look forward to sharing your ideas, answering your questions, and if you want to be on Sharing the Brain, let us know. Thanks for sharing the brain. All right, so welcome back to all right, take 6.